You're listening to the 2022 Nelson Arts Festival Pukapuka Talks. This session, The Forgotten Epidemic, features Wendy Nissen and Charity Norman in conversation with Kerry Sunderland. Kia ora koutou, and welcome to The Forgotten Epidemic, with a very deliberate question mark on the end, and you'll find out why in the session title. So I'm very delighted. Thank you, Wendyl and Charity, for joining me. I'm just going to introduce our two authors, and then we're going to get into the discussion about their amazing books, My Mother and Other Secrets and Remember Me, and the topic in general of dementia. So if you could count up all the top-selling magazines she's either helmed or written for, which include Women's Day, Women's Weekly, New Zealand Gardener, and Good Magazine most recently, and the book she's published, which is some 11, I believe now, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I think so, yeah.
Wendy Nissen is probably one of the most widely read women in the country. She has written books that are mostly focused on living a chemical-free, old-fashioned life. Her most recent book is Natural Care, which was published earlier this year. Was it?
Yes.
Right. That's right, yeah. But she's here today to talk about her 2020 memoir, My Mother and Other Secrets. Wendy Nissen is the daughter of Nice Alice, Lady Alice, and Bad Alice, and we'll hear more about that later. She now lives in the Aotearoa, unplugged from the rat race and in tune with the natural world. Her son Daniel has accompanied her to Nelson this weekend too. So would you please join me in welcoming Wendy Nissen? Thank you. Okay. Charity Norman, immediately to my right, is the best-selling author of 7 novels. Born in Uganda and brought up in drafty vicarages in the north of England, she spent some years in escapist travel before becoming a barrister specialising in crime, family law and mediation. In 2002, she saw the light. Realising that her 3 small children had barely met her, she took a break from the law and moved with them and her Kiwi husband to Aotearoa, New Zealand. So you have been compared to some of the big names in fiction, Jodi Picoult and Leanne Moriarty. And like these other writers, your writing really tackles some of the big topics in life in a very intimate way. So that's topics like the impact of terrorism, how we can all be susceptible to coercion and cultic behaviour. And Charity was just at the previous session too.
Which is wonderful.
Yeah. As well as complex family dynamics, exploring how tragic accidents, adoption and incarceration can forever change people's lives. And Charity currently divides her time between Wellington and Hawke's Bay, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, great.
Pretty
So
much.
join me in welcoming Charity. Great. Okay, so I am coping without my glasses. So here we go, keep going. So you have both transformed your experiences of watching your mothers retreating from the world with dementia, and you've transformed them into these 2 amazing books here. I was most intrigued by the way you both used your writing to explore how and when someone deteriorates. It can give their family and friends the opportunity to find out things about them that they didn't know before. And as filters crack and walls come down. In Wendyl's case, you uncovered a host of family secrets. And in Charity's case, you didn't think your mother had any dark secrets, but it planted a seed for this novel, Remember Me.
Yes.
Yeah. So now, Wendy, you've published a couple of novels, but you usually write non-fiction, and Charity, you are a novelist. So my first question for both of you, and perhaps Wendy, you can go first, is I want to start by asking you whether it was a default decision to write in the form you did, or whether you consciously considered, how am I going to write about this what's happened in my life and what's happened to my mum and my relationship with her?
Yeah, it was no conscious decision at all. It was a real hodgepodge, actually, my poor publisher. So I've written a lot of non-fiction books, on natural care, as you say, and I have a very good relationship with my publisher. And I was driving along with my mother while she was in the middle of her dementia, and she started talking to me about the clouds and how she likes to walk in the clouds and she likes to sit there. And And I realised, and so we had this big conversation, and it was like being on LSD or something. And she was like, it's hard jumping from one to the other. You've got to be very careful. And I realised that the demented mind was actually really interesting. And I knew that around me, a lot of people were dealing with this with their own parents or family members. So I sort of wrapped off a proposal to my publisher. Oh, this would be great. Dementia is going to be huge, as a sort of commercial kind of mind. And she said, yes, sure, go ahead, because she trusted me as a writer. But the book she got was just absolutely not what I proposed at all. It was half my memoir of a childhood, half my mother's memoir, half about dementia and dealing with it and advice. And she was very polite, and she liked it. But she was like, this isn't what you promised. And I said, well, I'm sure I'm not the first author to have done that. So it's a very unusual book in that it has not really much structure, but she got a good editor on, thank God, who kind of took bits and put them around. So it just came from me. And fortunately, it was during lockdown. So I was deep in research. I just immersed myself in it, in that process that a lot of writers do. I just went right down and out it came.
Yeah, and that was not long after your mother had died.
No, it was literally probably 8 months after she died.
Yeah. So it was just a compulsion to tell that story.
And it was a grief process. Yeah. And people say that people do write their own processes into their work. And I mean, anyone who reads the book or has read the book, I mean, my grief process was just, I didn't miss her one bit. You know, I had not a very good relationship with my mother. So it was anger, really. 6 months of crying with anger at what she'd done to me. So in some ways I sort of came out the other side of that and decided to be more empathetic towards her life and how she became who she was. And the end, obviously.
Did that make you feel more empathetic, writing?
Yeah, it helped me really understand. And I worked really hard, as I know you did in your book, to be very empathetic, to go, they acted this way because of that. And I learned so much about caring for someone with dementia that I thought that was useful as well. And I have to say that even though she was not great as a mother, in the last 2 years of her life, we got on really well. So her bad stuff died, or was starved, as I said, by the dementia. And for the first time in my life, she told me she loved me and that she was proud of me. Oh, so, yeah, it's kind of worth it.
So, Charity, Remember Me opens with Emily Kirkland, your main character, returning to New Zealand to care for her father who has dementia. And you shift the focus entirely. I mean, then there's also the 25-year-old cold case that kind of actually the book opens with.
Yes.
So what came first, the cold case mystery or the decision to write about the tragedy of dementia? So, and was it a natural thing to, I want to write, being a novelist, I want to write a novel about this topic? I mean, when did dementia come into that
Yes,
story?
what is this book?
Yeah.
And when did it become that?
Yeah.
It's almost simultaneously, I think. I was thinking about what to write next. And several things came together. One was that I wanted to write about the whānau range and those sort of mysterious mountains and being lost. And I wanted to write about. I was in Wellington at the time, and so thinking about the whānaus was a sort of was quite an immersive experience. You know, when you're homesick, you're often better at writing about the place. But the other thing was that, similar to Wendyl in a way, but with more distance in terms of time separation, my mother, Beryl, had Alzheimer's, and she became steadily worse. So each year when I went back, she became more unwell, and she finally died in 2016. I knew she was dying because she had pneumonia, and you recognise that, Wendyl. Yeah. And, you get that news and you know what it means. And so I was telling my siblings, you realise this is it. And they didn't seem to understand. And I was trying to get a flight, and it all got very complicated. And I got the news when I arrived in Hong Kong. I got a phone call to say that she died. So I hadn't made it. But in a sense, that didn't really didn't matter. But I was there in time to help my father, who was sort of about 90, organise a funeral. and tidy up her things and so on. And so I was in her bedroom and as I walked into this bedroom, I rapidly realised that it was like a museum. Her intellect had lasted her, the last vestiges, and she had a massive intellect. She spoke Hebrew and ancient Greek and Latin. She could learn a new language very rapidly. When she was in Uganda, she was teaching classical Greek. She had an intellect, but it had lasted her until about 2008 or 9, and after that she'd been pretending. And so when I walked into the room, I saw that all the letters, all the correspondence about these tours she used to run, and so on, they all ended in about then, 2009. And after that, things were just piled up unopened. So you could actually see, it was like a 7 or 8 year old museum of what my mother had been like then. And then in the drawer of her desk, I found the diaries from that time and earlier, much earlier. And they weren't private Anne Frank diaries, they were appointment diaries, so I didn't feel too guilty about flicking through them at all. Well, I don't feel guilty about reading people's diaries. I'm really nosy.
Writers love diaries.
I found my sister's when I was 13, that was an eye-opener. Anyway, oh my goodness, that's another story. But,
it's another book, probably.
That was hot stuff. The Organist. Anyway, so my mother had, she'd written things like "Charity is coming to stay," but then I went to and big letters, unlike childlike massive letters, and all the letters were the wrong. It said be a lowercase, uppercase, and then I went to the back. She'd written a list of there's 7 children in our family. She'd written down all our names. One of my brother was killed in 91. She'd written Paul, who died, to remind herself that Paul died. And then she'd written, I was a teacher. I played the violin. This kind of thing, to try to remind herself of who she was. And I realised that way back in sort of 2005, she was holding on, paddling under the surface, trying to hold on to who she was. She'd written the name of Yanni, a Jewish girl they looked after in the Kindertransport, who I hadn't known was so important to her. But it was on this list in big letters. Don't forget Yanni. And so this was I realised that Mum, she, unlike your mother who became nicer, we saw nice Alice, my mother did the opposite. So as she was a lovely woman, empathetic, kind, all this, had all sorts of problems, I'm sure, but as she deteriorated, she became violent, angry, really raging. And so to read this, I understood what she was holding on to so desperately. And I thought about how frightened she might, how terrified she must have been. So that got me thinking. And then when I was thinking about writing this book, that came together with the Ranges, the cold case, and another subject which I can't really mention without a massive spoiler.
Yes, yeah. No, we won't go with spoilers with your one at all. And of course, Felix, a big part of Felix is Emily's father, who she comes home to look after. His little notes and things that he leaves around the house, and that's a really, kind of lovely part of the characterisation of him, isn't it? It's very much.
And people do.
Yeah.
They do
yes,
that.
absolutely.
And I also think that if I can pick up on the trying to pretend that they're not.
Yes.
My mother didn't want anyone to know, so she would literally have conversations with her friends who would come to visit, which basically she didn't understand, didn't say much, but she was determined. And I think if there's anything about caring for someone with dementia, that's the time when they need you the most. They need you to be their wingman, to sit there with them while they're having coffee with their friends and help them pretend.
Yes.
And I didn't really. I wish I had been more aware of what she was trying to do and helped her have that dignity as long as she could. And of course, in the end, the friends stopped coming.
Yes.
Because she wasn't making any sense.
You do that differently now.
I would tell her friends. She didn't tell any of her friends. I would have told them and said, you have to keep coming.
Well, hence the secrets. We'll
Yeah.
get more onto that.
Oh, God,
But
secrets.
just before we go on, I'd like to just ask you whether, because you said your mother got quite angry and your mother got nicer, what type of dementia did each of them have? So, and do you know, because I was wondering if there's different types of dementia where that's more likely to happen or not.
In my mother's case, it was Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's, okay.
In my mother's case, they never bothered to find out, which
Okay.
was very typical of my parents. I think it was probably vascular, by the way, vascular dementia post-stroke.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that finding all those goodies in your mother's desk and the documents and everything revealed that there was a whole inner life going on that almost she had completely hidden.
Yes.
And Wendyl, you write about the three Alices. Am I pronouncing your mum's
Yes,
name
that's
correct?
correct,
Great.
yes.
Nice Alice, Lady Alice, and Bad Alice. Towards the end of your mother's life, it's like she shed all of her armour, wasn't it? And
it just
went
came
back
off.
to nice Alice. It's funny because my mother has dementia as well. She has both Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. And sometimes when I'm with her, I feel like I've travelled back in time and I'm with her like she would have been as a 5 or 6 year old. She's sort of really retreated into being a girl. So watching someone disappear is dreadful, and I don't want to diminish that in any way or wish the experience on anyone. But what are some of the gifts? I mean, you mentioned it briefly in your introduction that you had the best 2 years of your life with your mum, and that she told you she loved you and she was proud of you for the
I
first
could
time.
forgive her
Yeah.
for what was a really awful childhood. My mother was an alcoholic, so I was a child, and I'll be talking to Noelle about this tomorrow, a child of an alcoholic mother, and she was pretty bad. So by the time I was 50, I pretty much had enough of her, and I couldn't hug her without feeling a sense of deep revulsion. So it was pretty bad. My brother was the same. We both kind of got to that age and went, we've had enough of your moods and the different personalities. And so we didn't really have much. We avoided her as much as we could. So Christmas and birthday, if you're lucky. So when I moved my parents in to live with us in the Hokianga in a kind of a unit next to our house, and initially I thought, well, this is me done. I was broadcasting at the time, gave up my job, just did the good daughter thing, and didn't resent it, just thought, well, you got to do it. What else am I going to do? And Dad wasn't coping. But yeah, as I wrote in the book, by the end of it, I realised I'd been given such a gift. I had seen through these, as you say, the armour, the plates of armour that over her life, because of her childhood and her terrible, terrible life in her early years, they came away. So I got to see the mother I always wanted. And I think, even though she wasn't really there, she kind of, we'd play Scrabble every day, we hugged, we kissed, it was just amazing. And at the time, I remember thinking, this is pretty cool. But it wasn't until afterwards, when I was writing about it, I was like, well, I have been given a gift. It was horrible for her. I mean, no one wants to have dementia. It's a horrible thing to go through. But it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. And the secrets she told me, which helped me. The book has a lot of family history, but it helped me weave together where I came from, because she was adopted. So there was a whole string of the family that I didn't know about. So I managed to, as Māori like to go back and back and back, I couldn't. It sort of stopped. So it helped me do that. For my brother and I, we both kind of filled in all those jigsaw pieces that were missing.
Now, like me, your mother lived in another country when she was unwell and dying. But were there things that in the last part of her life that changed in the nature of the relationship you had with her, or things that you took? Yeah.
Yes, and not perhaps as positive, but certainly even though she became Mrs. Rochester, really, I mean, I if I could digress briefly, I remember the book launch. She was very proud, even though she had dementia, she was very proud when my first book, Free and Grace, came out. She would always remember Free and Grace, and she'd say on the phone, "Hello, Charity, Free and Grace." But my father would always, and one of the positives was their love affair. He continued to cover up for her and to try. He always looks immaculate, but even though she looked like Mrs. Rochester, he took her everywhere with him. And even though she lost her tube ticket, every time they went anywhere, he would always give her. And I'd say, "Dad, why do you always give her? She'll lose it." But he was protecting her dignity. He didn't want to treat her like a child. But on the launch of my, I think, second book, and we were in the bookshop in London, South London, was packed. You know, the publishers were there, and I was making a speech, and I was standing up on a pile of A4 paper, very short, making a speech, and I was telling a funny story. Well, I thought it was funny. And my mother was there becoming increased. She had no idea where she was. Why is it so hot? Why are all these people there? I don't want to be here. And I'd come to the punchline, and I paused for effect. And into the silence came my mother's voice saying, "We are all dead." I say, yeah, I mean, I know it's bad, Mum, but it's not that bad. And so, you know, there were that moments of, and I don't think she was that unhappy. She just thought we were all dead, and perhaps, who knows, perhaps we are. And then right at the end, there was that gentleness came back. So once she was, it was actually me who took her to the the lockup, you know, to the dementia unit. I was there. There was a massive blow-up because my father was hospitalised with something completely unconnected, couldn't take care of her. When my siblings tried to take care of her, she thought they were kidnapping her. So the moment had come. And I've come all the way from New Zealand. My family always store up their crises for when I arrive. Like they wait for me to arrive.
Is that what happens when you go home?
Yeah,
I've always wondered about that.
And then they accuse you of swanning in and being bossy. Like, you just literally cannot win. So I swan it, and it's a complete chaos. And so we organised. So I took her to the dementia unit, and that is awful, isn't it? You feel such a bitch. You know, you're lying to your mother, and she's going to be locked up. And so I had taken her there, and I can't remember where I was going with this. But yes, after that, she was looked after better, and she was medicated.
Medicated is very important.
And she became much calmer, and then we had a lovely time. I remember another occasion visiting and singing with her my grandfather's clock. And I would sing, and she was looking at my mouth. And as we got to the last line, as she would always say, "When the old man died." And she did that. And then one time, the last time I saw her, she reached out and put her hand on mine and said, "I love you." And that was good. You know, that was something we might never have had that.
I think the important thing about that too, for anyone, and I'm sure there are people here who have friends or family with dementia, is that it's all in there.
Yes.
You know, and never forget that.
Yes.
Never forget that what you're seeing might be childlike, might be demented, might be not making sense, but in there. And I had to teach my dad that, because he was like, "Oh, I just can't make sense of her." And she says she's going to go off and start teaching at the local school, and she said, and I go, "Dad, just go along with it." It's, you know, and she knows, she can sense if you're being negative. So humour her, go along with it, encourage her. You know she's literally not going to go down and teach at the local school. And go along with her fantasy world, you know, where there are 3 cats and that, you know, just because she's still there. You know, her heart and her emotion are still picking up those things. So don't ever treat her as anything but the you know, amazing woman that she is. And once he got that, wow, it was so much better, because he just was like, "Oh, I get it." Because he would not read anything. The minute she was diagnosed, I was because I'm a journalist, reading every book I could on it, and I'd highlight bits and I'd give them to Dad, so you have to read this, and I go back the next day and say, "I just can't." Didn't want to know. He didn't have anything to do with her care. He could not handle it. So yeah, it's always the daughter.
So when you persuaded him to stop trying to put her right, to argue,
correct her.
Then correct her, like the clouds.
Like the clouds,
in the clouds.
Let's go on the clouds. What's
Yes.
it like up there? You know, and you have, and one of the books I did read, you know, it was a woman who had early dementia, and she was saying, you know, she would often see her parents who were long dead, and she'd talk about them, and her daughters would say, "Oh, Mum, they've died." She said, don't say that. Let's talk about it. You know, let me pretend, because she'll come right. In like a few hours, she'll be back onto something else. But there's no harm in going on the journey with them. And it can be quite fun. My mother-in-law has just died, actually, of dementia, long time for her. And on my visits, we'd have the best time, you know, and I'd talk in my book about, she'd say, oh, I've got a sore back. And, you know, you'd say, oh, you need to take some Panadol. Oh, I've got a sore back. And I just have well, maybe we'll get a hottie. Oh, I've got, you know, the repetition. So you have games with yourself of coming up with a million different answers.
Original ways of saying
Something different.
Yeah.
Yes.
And after a while, she'd stop saying, oh, I've got a sore back. Because in her mind, I'd taken her seriously in there somewhere. So, yeah, it's not all tragedy and sadness. There's times where you can actually just really enjoy. Yeah.
Playing along with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you both, there's this element, I just have my own curiosity around the role of emotional repression or suppression and the link to any form of dementia, because, I mean, obviously your mum had a lot of very traumatic experiences when she was younger and was carrying a lot of secrets. And Felix, your main character, without any spoilers, also has a lot of secrets. So I'm just interested, because you both kind of explore that, you know, topic. You're in that terrain, whether you have, I mean, we're not experts on dementia by any stretch, but if you had any thoughts about the link between that keeping secrets and not being able to express things that were difficult, and dementia, which is the ultimate forgetting, really, isn't it? Or the ultimate...
That is the irony.
Yes, that is the irony. I'm not an expert, but from, for example, my mother, of some personal experience, I think it was partly, looking back, I wonder whether the repression of emotion, she was brought up by people who became deeply evangelical religious Christians who toured America. She was quite repressed as a child, but then married my father, who was a vicar, and I think a lot of suppressed anger. But when my brother was killed in 1991 in a helicopter crash at the age of 30, she never slept again, really. And I never really slept again. And I think we can see the seeds of it there. I might be wrong. You know, you need a double-blind trial study, wouldn't you, to be absolutely sure that. Although we do know that lack of sleep can be devastating for the brain, but she would say, "Oh, I had a good night last night. I had 3 hours sleep," and so I think yes, undoubtedly there's some connection there.
Actually, and did you want to comment on that too?
As regards the secrets coming out, I mean, the thing is, my mum was a drunk. She was drunk every night of her life. And she never, you know, I don't know how your relationship with this alcohol, but if I have too many, I start talking. You know, I tell all sorts of secrets that I'm not supposed to tell. And what amazes me is she wasn't like, you know, she would drink so much and she would talk, and never, ever did those secrets come out. So you kind of get how buckled up it was. So I think it did take dementia to, and I like to think that maybe, you know how when you're holding secrets and it becomes quite uncomfortable, it's almost like you've told a lie, or you're kind of holding, you know, you just feel like you have to, and so that stress, her
feel
whole
like a
life.
fraud.
And then dementia loosening that, you know, I like to think that in her dementia she might have been able to breathe properly for the first time, because she had let them, as a aside to this, her sister, who was adopted alongside her, not her adopted sister, so they're not blood relatives. She was adopted, then her sister was adopted, has not spoken to me since this book has come out, because she's still holding all the secrets. And that was a really hard decision for me. I knew that the one person that was going to, my father was fine, my brother was fine, but I knew she was not going to like someone. I didn't tell half the secrets, to be honest. I did protect her in some ways, but she cannot deal with it. And that is a hard thing, I think, too, when you're writing about your own family. There's always someone who's going to not agree with you. But in this case, I felt it was my mother's story, it was my story, my brother's story, and so I wrote about it for that reason. And I felt those secrets had to be allowed out at last.
Yeah. So just before we move on, just like your thoughts again as non-experts in the medical sense about some of the other things, and whether you have concerns. And we talked a little bit about this backstage about whether you can inherit it. So apparently it's only about 10 to 15% of those with Alzheimer's who are thought to have inherited. The risk factors include, risk factors for all kind of sort of chronic disease that leads to death, things like smoking, obesity and high blood pressure. But there's a lot more research coming out all the time, and I'm just interested, because you mentioned your mother spoke many languages, and there was all those sorts of things that your mum played Scrabble, that's supposed to be good for your brain, isn't it?
She was so good at it. Like, she couldn't remember what time or day it was, but man, right up until the end, she could. A mean game.
Are either of you living your lives any differently now, knowing that, there's dementia has been in your family? Yes.
And
so
I'm sorry if we're upsetting some people in the audience. It's a tough thing if it's really close to you in your family. It can be very triggering. The weird thing that happened to me is my mother was overweight all her life, drank heavily, smoked for some of it, not all of it. Suddenly I lost a ton of weight. I was totally unconscious. From the moment she died, I started losing weight. And I thought, momentarily I should write a book on the dementia diet, just... but I think subconsciously I was like, I am not going to die that death. I am not. And so it was really, I lost the weight. I stopped drinking as much. I was never a big drinker, but I don't drink much at all anymore. And I really upped I swim every day for 20 minutes. I'm just like... And none of it was conscious at all. I just started doing these things. So subconsciously, I think I was just like, we're going to try and avoid that if we can. She was also a diabetic, so being overweight, diabetes, my age. So that was probably what I did. But at the same time, I've got quite a what would you call it? I'm quite philosophical about what's going to happen. Your life has to end somehow. I mean, every time my dad, who lives with me, does something stupid like mows the lawns and falls over or something, I say to my husband, he's got to die somehow. You've just got to take that attitude. You're going to die somehow. But I think for me, it was just, I'd probably try and avoid being, get rid of any things
obvious
that could
risk
lead...
factors.
Obvious risk factors,
Yes. Yes, I'd agree with that. You think about, you read the research, don't you? And you think about the obvious risk factors, try not to get viruses, try to stay reasonably fit, cut down maybe slightly on the drinking, try to get enough sleep. I tell my husband in the mornings that I should have a sleep in because I don't want to end up like my mother. So, come back at 10 with my cup of tea. It's like, we don't want me being like mum, do we? So it is those risk factors and the... but you panic, don't you? I don't know if you're the same. I mean, having seen somebody go through that, when your mind goes blank, or you walk into a room and you've forgotten what you came for, you can't find the car keys. There is that. In the old days, I'd just be, it's me. I'm always chaotic. I always was chaotic. Now it's, oh my God, it's happening. I'm turning into my mother, and it's starting. And I sort of say, you'll remember this moment, children. This is where you'll look back and you'll say, oh, this is when it started. And so I live in terror, really, but in quite a jovial way. But there are advances being made, and I read some research recently about the Mediterranean diet and lifestyle, and even some reversals that have been done in the march of dementia. So there's hope, I think.
I also became a vegetarian. I don't know what that has to do with it. But
are you feeling really good for it?
Very good, very good. But again, subconsciously, no decisions. Didn't sit down one morning and go, dear diary, I'm now going to be a vegetarian. I just stopped eating. It's the weirdest thing. And so spiritual people go, oh, she's up there and she's guiding you. And it's like... I think it's just common sense. I think in the back of my brain somewhere it's gone, okay, come on, let's be sensible. But yeah. Or else she is up there guiding me. Nice Alice.
Nice Alice.
Yeah.
I understand that one of the key early indicator or comorbidity thing is hearing loss as well. So that's really interesting. And apparently if that can be treated early, then it helps because, of course, retreating from the world inside is a big thing. But the other interesting link was between the sense of smell. So my mum was always so super sensitive to smells. Like we couldn't have I had to ask my my husband's daughter when she came to stay not to use any of her, impulse spray and things like that when Mum was around because it to set off migraines. And now she doesn't smell anything. And there's some, so the new research that's coming out, and I think with the loss of smell with COVID, there's been some, maybe some leaps and bounds.
And taste as well.
Taste,
my mum's taste when she would eat salt, just eat salt.
Oh my goodness.
She just couldn't taste it. It was like in Harry Potter, when they have the ghost to that party. But I'm wondering with the hearing loss, whether that's the connection is which way round it is. If you're isolated because you can't hear, or whether it can go both ways.
Yeah, and they don't seem to know the answer to that yet. So I'm also interested, because of your experience, and it's a shared reality for me, and I know it is for some people in our audience too, about doing the long distance thing. Like, do you have any tips about,
Yeah, my father's 96, going on 97, and as well. So, do I have any tips? And incidentally, also my sister had a head injury, so she had dementia too, and she actually died in March this year. That's all right. It was a long story. And I have regrets. So I suppose my tip would be, don't be like me. Write that postcard. Make that phone call. Send the email. I've started since my sister died, and I felt guilty. I hadn't. She was very demented, but she lived alone. She would have loved to have had a postcard from me once a week. I didn't do it, and so we can all learn. We're not too old to learn. So now, although my father can't hear me very well, he lives at home, but he can't hear me on the phone, and that's frustrating and difficult and depressing for him. So I've started trying to write to him at least once a week with the news. So I suppose the tip is do it now. Make the connection. Visit if you can. Call them if you can. Do whatever you can do to keep that connection.
I think also, speaking from someone who was in the same house, literally, I noticed when Mum went into care later that a lot of relatives treat their demented family or friends really badly. They'll say, no, you've got that wrong. And you'd hear them talking to them like, please. And then I know in my own family, my husband's family, they didn't want to visit my mother-in-law because she's not making any sense. Why should I sit there? My own brother said about my mother, I'm not going to see her anymore because she doesn't make any sense. And that is the worst thing you can do because, as I was saying, it's in there and you go and you visit and it's tiresome and it's boring and it's repetitive. Sometimes it can be stressful if you've got a parent who's gone the other way, and sometimes be really boring. And, some visits are just terrible. You sit there and you look at your parent and you think, how did you end up like this? You're just a vegetable, and all these thoughts going through your head, but you got to do it. You got to do it. You got to sit there, and because you'll be glad later, because when they're dead, you'll think, well, I did my best.
For you and for them.
And it was tough. And in my mother's case, we had to drive 2 hours to get to her because we live so rurally. It's awful. Drive 2 hours, sit there and listen to someone not talking and upsetting you and you feeling bad. But then, on the day before she died, my husband visited her in the morning on his way down to Auckland, and my dad visited her in the afternoon, and there was no change in her. We didn't really see any, but the last thing she said to my husband was, "You're gorgeous." So at my last visit with her, because you could hear, make sort of like 25% of what she said in my last visit the day before, she said, "Go get me some fags," because she hadn't smoked for years. And so we had a laugh. I said, "I used to smoke Pall menthol, and I used to buy it at the dairy," and that was the last thing she said to me. "Go get me some fags," because she was very posh, of course. But occasionally her New Plymouth Fitzroy accent would come out, and she was a bit rough. And if we hadn't visited her, we wouldn't, So yeah.
So with that's a classic example. Did you say you were going to go and get them, but you just didn't? Yeah.
I said, "Oh yeah, I'll go and get you Pall menthol." Or something. She was, "Oh," she laughed, and and that is the thing. You don't go, "Oh, you don't smoke anymore. Don't be ridiculous." You go, "Oh yeah, okay, that'll be nice, won't it?"
Yeah.
Bit of a menthol.
Yeah.
And when you
Classy.
come back 5 minutes later, she's forgotten, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a great cover story in The Listener earlier this year, and it was coincidentally in the same edition that there was an article with you about your
Yes.
book.
Yes.
In that article about dementia, Sir Richard Fall, who's a neuroscientist, said that it's a new state of mind and that people need to be given hope. So how are some of the ways, I mean, you can give hope that you're going to go and buy her packet of cigarettes, but yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that kind of idea of, playing along and giving someone something positive or something to focus on.
Well, I
in the
think as a
conversations.
community, we have to be more accepting of dementia.
Yeah.
They're not weirdos. They're not people who should be tucked away in care homes and never seen again. They should, as long as you can, be out in the community with you, and they should be accepted. And, like your mother shouting that out at your book launch, we should all just go, oh, yeah, dementia, good. It's just, I think we really need to, as a community, it is going to be an epidemic. We are, all the figures are, the figures, as I think you said in the intro in the program, we have to be more inclusive. And I think of Down syndrome. We had a family friend who had Down syndrome. She grew up with us. We all learn to accept Down syndrome, and I don't even think you call it Down syndrome. I apologise, whatever you call it now. And that was fine. So I think now with dementia, we do have to. They stay with us. They come to the dinners. They come to the afternoon teas. They come to the shows. They come everywhere. And yeah, they might say the odd thing that's a bit odd, but it's all right. She's got dementia.
We have to stop being embarrassed by that,
Yes,
though, don't we?
And the thing is, they are really embarrassed, as our parents were. They try and hide it. They try and... so the more we can talk about it and be inclusive, and every time I see someone with dementia, I always sit down and chat and try and model, I have a good old chat, and, we probably don't talk about much, but I don't just leave her sitting in the corner, which is usually what happens when you go to a gathering and there's someone like that. They're sort of off in the corner, and they usually have hearing problems, and, so I guess that was what I would like. It is, you have to be hopeful, and you have to value... it is a progressive disease, so they are going to die of it, but it could be 10 or 12 years. So why make that 10 or 12 years a penance or a tragedy or, oh, this has happened to us, try and not... celebrate's the wrong word, but, try and be inclusive and build it into the way your family exists now. I don't know, I guess that's what I would say.
Sort of realism.
Yeah.
Yes. And generational too, the generations. There's a book called Being Mortal.
Yes.
You come across.
Aotearoa Wendy's
That's
book,
it.
yeah.
That's it. This idea, and I certainly saw it with both my mother and others who I've visited, one for one reason and another, that having children or animals around, that life, plants, we all need those things, don't we? We were talking before, house plants die in my house, but having life around, and certainly for my mother, there was a lady who used to come and do when my father could no longer cope, come and do the cleaning once a week, and she had a toddler. And my mother loved to play with this toddler, and it gave real hope and joy, and she reminded her of that she was a mother, and she was genuinely happy in those days. So I think normality as much as...
Normality, and young children are really good with people with dementia. There's something... They haven't yet built up those barriers. They're quite open to communicate. I love reading, they do experiments where they get the old people with the young kids and put them all in the room,
And they will start
amazing,
smiling.
amazing. And I got a shock one day. I walked in, my mum was stroking my cat. She had hated cats her whole life. And here she was gently stroking. It's like, isn't she lovely? I'm like, oh my God. It's just that yet another clunk has come away. You now like cats. So what happened with the cat when you were young? I think her sister threw it at her or something.
So I just want to zoom out a bit now and look at some of the kind of systems that need changing, the sort of bigger picture things. And you both write about the value of having conversations when you're still well with your loved ones about what you want for your own end of life to look like, and the idea of an advanced healthcare directive or something similar to that. In Remember Me, hopefully this doesn't sound like a spoiler, but Felix presents Emily with a copy of his living will. And at first she responds that it looks a lot like euthanasia. his request, and he quickly contradicts her. Can you tell us more about that without giving away too much of the plot?
Yeah, so he's a GP, Felix, a retired GP. So he knows a lot about what end of life can look like, particularly in rural New Zealand back in the day. And actually, that conversation they had took place, very similar conversation took place between myself and my mother-in-law, who was starting to have, her parents had both died of strokes. So statistically, she was not looking too hopeful. And she had begun to slightly waver. And I remember sitting out on her deck, she was still living at home, and I was visiting her, and she said, I want to show you something. And she went and got her living will that she just had drawn up. And she said, she's got 6 children. She said, I don't know if any of them will stick with this, but I want you to keep a copy. Don't let me go like my mother did, she said. Do anything you can do. Save me from it. Here is your copy. I want you to be the angel of death at my bedside. And so when she, years later, broke her hip, I was in angel of death mode. I was galloping down to that hospital, waving the living will. And in fact, she did survive that on that occasion. But, so that was what reminded me later when I was writing about Felix. But I do have a friend who had Parkinson's, who actually died a few weeks ago. But she had something much more watertight.
Yeah.
The directive, and so when she could no longer swallow, the directive swung into action.
Yeah, it is. I've put a copy in the book because my mother had a living will, but it was written 20 years ago, and they basically, the hospital said, got nothing, it won't work. So I write a lot about this, trying to get my mum to die, basically, and having a hospital that discharged her pretty much, as she would say, a vegetable, and just unable to get her to die because they kept feeding her because she kept eating. And I would go in and I write about it. I used to go in and whisper in her ear, "Stop eating. Stop eating," and I'd close the door so the nurses wouldn't hear me because, and I did look, I thought, do I put a pillow over her head? I mean, you are in so much agony and pain seeing them in such a terrible, terrible state and knowing how much they would have hated to be in that state. So you literally do look at killing them. And, if I could have, I would have, but I knew there's no way I could do it. So yes, the advance directive, and actually I've been talking to someone about this, it's kind of slowly being accepted by hospitals and care. In my mother's case, the man who made the decision, I felt, made the wrong decision and was, I don't know, he had other reasons. He was, there's that old generation of healthcare professionals who they're God. So that is slowly dissipating, and if you have an advance directive, well then they have to literally, and that happened with my mother-in-law, so she refused food, and so slow, it didn't happen as, I was like you, I was like marching in there, give her the morphine, and they were like, oh well, we're just going to give her some minor pain relief. Not minor, I was just like, kill her now, and of course my husband and my brother-in-law were like, stop, she's dying. And they were taking her blood pressure. Why are you taking that? She's dying. Because it stresses them out. Because it's, and I say, just let her go, just inject her. And of course they can't do that. So she took a week to die. I could not stand it. I could not stand by and watch this woman I loved. But they did. And they did it beautifully. And while they were there, they planned her funeral while she was there. They wrote things. They talked to her. My brother-in-law played the guitar. I was like, oh, you guys. I was just so impatient.
So it was a valuable time for them.
It was a beautiful time for them. Whereas me, with my advance directive and my experience with my mother, I was like, right, she's allowed to go. And, it's a horrible thing, if anyone knows, to watch someone die that slowly. It's over a week. So there's swings and roundabouts. Just because you've signed it, and we had an advance directive for her, I made sure she had one. It doesn't mean that you're going to Dignitas and you're going to lie there and someone's going to magically help you die. You literally are just allowed to die. They're not, and they'll give you a bit of pain relief, but they're certainly not. Nature take its course, which is better than force feeding and keep drips, which is I think what a lot of them used to do. It's like, let's keep this person alive at any cost. So I think there is a groundswell happening, and I think it's being driven by our generation because we're watching our parents die some pretty horrible deaths. Well, I certainly did with my mother. So, I think the advance directive, and now we've got, euthanasia laws slowly crawling their way. Eventually, I sort of have this hope that by the time it's our turn, it'll be much easier. Yes. But I am going to Dignitas. I've looked into it. I'm not going to die a natural death. It's not going. I'm sorry. I've horrified people. Well, I've seen 2 women I love die of dementia and decline, and I've seen the effect it had on me, and I'm just not going to do that to my children. So I've talked to them all, and of course they're very upset and they don't want it to happen. But I'm reading more and more of people who get a dementia diagnosis and off they go. I'm lucky I can afford to do that, but it certainly would save a lot of money on the health system. I think it would save a lot of grief for my family and heartache. So that is and I will do it. Unless you can do it closer to home, but I don't. We have to wait and see.
The key thing, I think, though, is that you're having those conversations now with your family.
None of them are agreeing with me.
None of them are agreeing, but they know what you want.
Especially my husband. I'm like, you're going to keep me alive.
Yeah. Are there any things that you could reflect on, Charity? Because obviously you live here in Aotearoa, but your mother died with dementia in the UK. Is there anything they're doing better there or worse that we could learn from?
I've nothing obvious. Of course we have the assisted dying bill that's passed here, which they haven't, and they were very interested in that when it happened. I had people phoning to ask me, how did this come about and what did I think? But no, the same conversations. It's a bit quicker to get to Dignitas. Yeah. You haven't got to fly quite so far. Yeah. Eat so much airline food on the way. But
I read a lot in the English papers. A lot of people over there are doing that and writing about it, which is the other thing. That whole stigma. People are openly writing about it, writing about their experiences, writing books, and normalising it.
This conversation. As you say, it's a privilege. I don't know if it's a privilege to go, but to be able to make that choice.
Absolutely.
Which
not everyone can.
No, most of the 68 million people in Britain couldn't do. But I think the conversations are the same that we're having here.
Yeah. And the same challenges in terms of healthcare, aged care and all that sort of thing.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, at the moment, even more of a challenge because the whole thing's chaos.
Yes. Yeah.
The
UK is chaos, isn't it? Yeah. Let's not go there.
Yeah.
So I'd like to open up for questions now from the audience, if anyone would like to ask a question. Ange has the mic here, so, look, you don't have to pass it very far at all.
Hi. Do I have to eat it? I do too.
That's all right. It's okay.
I work for an organisation where I oversee a lot of clients, and probably about 80% of my clients have got dementia. So my question is about music and things. Did you notice with your mothers that using music was therapy and soothing for them?
Interesting you should ask that. My mother was a music teacher and a very good pianist. So I, marched in, got the radio set up with the concert program, told her nurses, leave it on. Next time I visited, it was off. Apparently, she didn't like it. So, but I understand for some people it does. But my brother-in-law would go in and play the guitar to my mother-in-law. He'd sit there patiently playing it, and then she'd listen, and then he'd stop and she'd say, "I want to die." So we're not sure if that was therapeutic, but he kept doing it, and that's why I keep saying keep doing, just anything, because he found talking, he found it frustrating. So, but he could go and sit there and play his guitar and have time with his mum, and I want to die. So that's all the. I can't
Gave
really
him something he could do.
Yeah.
My mother was a musician too.
Yeah.
And yes, we did play her from very early on. Carols from Kings at Christmas time, particularly sing along. And the music that she liked changed as her brain atrophied, and it did atrophy. the music she wanted to hear became more simple. She did become more childlike. And so by the end, we were singing My Grandfather's Clock and other similar songs. Those are the songs she'd sung to me when I was a little girl. And so the role was reversed. But over the years, yes, she absolutely would be soothed by music. And I think that was something, we tried to take our own music player when she finally went into the unit. And it wasn't always used as much as I think it could have been, and we would put it on. So yes, very helpful. But the songs of her youth, the songs of wartime, all of that, would really. And she would then start to sing, or hymns. She'd sing along to hymns, and that would really have a jolly good old sing-song, belt it out, and that would really cheer her up. I think that's got the endorphins going. Do you find?
Sorry.
I was going to say, do you find that helps?
All my clients live in their own homes, and I oversee the carers that look after them. So we're learning a lot about dementia because we've got so many clients with dementia now. So, and just for me, finding out about simple things that might help ease. I'm doing a lot of reading like you have, and finding out so much information. But
one thing worked with my mother. She was obsessed with food her whole life. Loved recipe books or cuisine magazines, and that she could spend hours looking at food. So it's just finding that one thing that that triggers, that can just keep them busy, that keeps them happy and calm. Yeah.
And a sense of who they are. This is who I am. I know about cooking. I know about music.
And I used to spend a lot of time with both my mother-in-law and my mother, just talking to them about their lives, and I remember with my mother, I remember when you were a nurse and you used to deliver babies in Fiji. Did I? But you could tell that they kind of loved hearing their stories back to them. So, just finding anything to talk to them about, really. They're good listeners.
It's funny how it will unlock a part of a memory too.
Yes.
Doing that, and a particular piece of music will unlock a bit of memory. I mean, with my sister, who couldn't remember anything, didn't know really anything about what was going on in the world. But if you begin to sing a part of an opera that she used to love before she got a head injury, she would suddenly know all the words and sing the whole thing and think, who is in there and where are you? So, and that's cheering, I think.
You have another question?
A number of years ago, 20 years ago, my father went into a village, into an apartment, and I was asked if I would like to sign. He had signed a living will in 1990s. I was asked if I would like to sign a paper to say that he was not to be given antibiotics other than perhaps for a cut or a wound, but not to stop
Pneumonia. Yeah.
And later, when his dementia, Alzheimer's, became worse, he had to move to a more protected environment. The same happened. And yet another relative of mine had her husband in a village with bad Alzheimer's, had a stroke, and a doctor brilliantly saved his life. She had not been asked, and the whole family had gathered, and it was an absolute tragedy. So I think people should know. I know everyone can do this living will business through the hospitals. Everybody can end-of-life care statement, and I think most people should know about that.
And the thing to note about that is when I made sure my mother-in-law had one, when we mentioned it to her care home, they said, oh yeah, we've got one here. They don't bring it up. They don't offer it to you. Well, in your case they did, which is great, but they don't bring it up, but they've got it there. And so it was really, and it is mainly stop antibiotics. That's really the only power you have. My mother was a diabetic. So I said, well, when she goes into, if the blood levels, she goes into a coma, just let her. Oh, no, we're not allowed to. I said, why? Why can't you let her go? And they were like, oh, it's like giving food. You've got to give her the sustenance of the insulin. So that was, so that's really all you can do is prevent antibiotics. And I think the one that I've got in there also asks not to feed if you can't eat stuff. No resuscitation. Yeah. But you really have to make it happen. You will not be offered it. And some doctors are deeply, opposed to it. Some doctors believe, as this doctor, that, you've got to save their lives no matter what, even if they're going to end up living like this terrible life. So you do have to be very proactive and be the bossy boots, as we both were, march in there and have those conversations and don't go away. And I didn't with my mother. So that's part of the reason I wrote the book. I didn't know how to get through this guy. I'm a real bossy boots and I'm tough. But this guy, I was grieving, I was in shock, and I couldn't find the way to stick up for my mum's rights. And I deeply regret that. And I'm tough. So if that's me, imagine if you're not tough and you're up against that. Yes, we have a question. Oh, sorry, I've taken over your role.
Yes, just one more question, we do need to.
Thank you. Yes,
Okay.
thank
Could you just quickly paraphrase that, please, for the recording?
So basically, in my book, I have listed the document that is kind of a general document, and it's not called End of Life Care, it's called Advance Directive, and it lists all the things that you don't want. And you're right, it's good to take it to the lawyer. I got my dad to take his to the GP and sign it off, and that was really useful because she had a few comments, and so and it's on his records. People keep them in their glove box in their car. You give them to every child, you give them to everyone, and get your lawyer to, because the issue is some doctors in hospitals will say, oh, but she can't make that decision. So that you have to prove that they made that decision when they were compos mentis, before the dementia had taken over. And kind of fudged that with my mother-in-law. But and so a doctor who wants to keep your relative alive will say, well, you can't prove that she was compos mentis when she signed that. And that's the issue. But to my knowledge, and so far, there's been no court case or anything where anyone's been taken to court for wrongfully, killing someone. So, but it is a very important document, you're right. And I'm glad that you all did it because it was in my book. And so far, I haven't heard of anyone denying someone those wishes. I have a lawyer who's contacted me who claims that her mother wasn't, so we're talking about that and seeing if we need to do something around that. But yeah.
It's a good idea to take it to a lawyer, particularly if there might be family conflict.
Well,
Yes.
that's the other thing. Within the,
common.
there can be children who go, well, I don't want her to die. My family, it'll be like that. God,
I just wanted to make the point, they're two different documents.
yes.
And they're quite different. You're given one by your GP here. The other is the model of the directive, which is legally binding.
And by the way, it says in the, and I quote this in the book, like the medical council supports it on their website. The health department has them on their website. So this is, it's all there, but you're just not. No one's talking about it and no one's saying, get it done.
And on that note, we are talking about it and you all here listened, and that's wonderful because it's the beginning of many conversations I hope you can have with your families and your loved ones and your friends about your wishes for what your good death might look like. So please join me in giving a big round of applause to Wendy Nissen and Charity Norman. Thank you.
Thank you.